The third shift handoff at Orbital Station Karev Show was already falling apart when Telvari arrived. She pressed through the maintenance corridor with her apprentice satchel slung across one shoulder, datapad clutched to her chest, and found the outgoing crew chief, a broad-shouldered Maylori named Dursk, shouting at the environmental console while coolant warnings pulsed amber across every panel in the bay. Two senior technicians stood behind him, arms folded, their expressions saying the same thing their mouths would not. This was not their problem anymore. Panel 47 is dumping thermal load into the port-side residential ring, Dursk said without turning around. It started 40 minutes ago. We've tried rerouting through the secondary cascade, and it's not holding. Did anyone check the physical valve assembly? A voice asked from beneath the floor grating. Telvari looked down. Through the metal lattice she could see a pair of human hands scarred, oil dark, the knuckles swollen with years of grip work and the top of a balding head. The human was lying on his back in the crawlspace, half buried in conduit housing, a battered multi-spanner resting on his chest. The valve assembly is automated, Dursk said, the way someone explains gravity to a child. Automated doesn't mean it works, the human said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up. He simply reached deeper into the conduit housing and did something with his hands that Telvari could not see. And 6 seconds later the amber warnings across the bay shifted to green. Every technician in the room went quiet. Dursk stared at the console. Then he stared at the floor grating. Then he turned and walked out without another word, the shift change complete in everything but the paperwork. That was the first time Telvari saw the human they called Machen. She had been assigned to him 3 days earlier by the station's labor allocation office. An apprenticeship placement, the kind the Karev administrative class handed out to young Valith, who had tested well enough in technical aptitude but not well enough for the officer academies. Telvari had ranked 11th out of 1,400 candidates for the engineering oversight track. The top 10 had been selected for commission posts aboard warships and diplomatic cruisers. 11th meant she was surplus. Surplus meant she was assigned to maintenance. And maintenance, on Karev Show, meant working under whatever senior technician had an open slot. That senior technician was a human. She had not known what to make of it. Humans held labor contracts on Karev Show, perhaps 200 of them spread across the station's lower decks, doing the work that Valith technicians considered beneath their training. Pipe fitting, thermal regulation, waste processing. The kind of work that kept a station of 40,000 souls breathing and warm, and that no one with rank ever thought about until it stopped working. Machen had been on the station for 11 years. He held no rank. He had no title beyond maintenance lead, third shift, environmental sector. He ate in the lower deck canteen with the dock hands and the cargo loaders. He wore the same faded gray coveralls every day, patched at the elbows and stained at the knees with lubricant that never quite washed out. He was perhaps 50 standard years old, though with humans it was difficult to tell their faces carried labor differently than Valith faces, the lines cutting deeper but the eyes staying sharper. On her first morning, she had reported to his workstation expecting a briefing, an orientation, a syllabus. Perhaps she had been trained to expect syllabi. Instead, Machen had looked up from the pipe fitting he was soldering, studied her for a moment with those hard brown human eyes and said, "You eat yet?" She had not. He had handed her a thermos of broth, some earth recipe, thick and savory, nothing she recognized, and pointed at the crawlspace hatch. "Eat that, then follow me. Don't touch anything until I tell you what it does." That had been 3 days ago. In those 3 days, Telvari had learned more about the physical infrastructure of Karev Show than she had in 4 years of technical schooling. She had learned that the automated valve assemblies on the port side ring had a manufacturing defect that caused them to seize under sustained thermal load, and that the correct fix was not a software patch, but a quarter turn of a manual override handle that the original installers had welded shut because it was not part of the automated system. Machen had cut the welds himself, years ago, on every valve in his sector. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had thanked him for it. She had learned that the water reclamation filters on decks 14 through 22 needed to be physically inspected every 72 hours, not every 120 hours as the maintenance schedule prescribed, because the biofilm cultures used in Valith water processing were sensitive to a particular frequency of vibration produced by the station's own gravity generators, and the filters degraded faster than the engineers who designed them had accounted for. She had learned that Machen knew this not because he had been told, but because he had noticed. 11 years of crawling through the guts of the station, and he had simply noticed things that the people who built it had missed. It unsettled her. Not Machen himself, he was quiet, patient, and utterly without pretension. What unsettled her was the realization that the station she had spent her life on, the station that the Valith Directorate pointed to as a triumph of engineering, was held together in significant part by the decisions of a man who ate broth from a thermos in a crawl space and wore coveralls with patches on the elbows. On the third day, before the valve incident, she had asked him about his hands. They were in the crawl space beneath the hydroponics bay, and Machen was showing her how to seat a replacement gasket in a nutrient feed line. The gasket had to compress evenly too tight on one side, and the seal would fatigue within a month. Too loose, and it would weep. He pressed it in with his thumbs, rotating it a few degrees, pressing again, rotating, and she watched the scar tissue across his knuckles stretch white with each push. "Did you train for this?" she asked. "On Earth?" "I trained as a machinist," he said. "Tool and die. Small shop in a city called Dearborn. Made parts for combustion engines, a kind of machine Earth used before we figured out better ones." "And you came here?" "The shop closed. Engines changed. The skills didn't transfer to the new ones, at least not in a way that anyone wanted to pay for." He gave the gasket a final press and held his hand flat against it, checking the compression by touch. Human labor contracts on Valith stations were paying. "So I signed one. For 11 years. The first contract was 3 years. I renewed it, then I renewed it again." He pulled his hand back and examined the gasket. Satisfied, he began wiping his tools. The station needed someone who could work with their hands. The Valith engineers are brilliant. I mean that your people design beautiful systems, but they design for the specification, and specifications live on paper. Pipes live in the wall. There's a gap between those two places, and someone has to stand in it. She had written that down, too. Not the words exactly, but the idea. The gap between the specification and the pipe. Between the plan and the thing the plan was supposed to describe. She had been trained to trust the plan. Machen had been trained to trust the pipe. She was beginning to understand which one kept people alive. The third day also brought a small incident that stayed with her longer than the valve repair. They were walking through a residential corridor on deck 15 off their usual route, because Machen had wanted to check a junction box he had noticed making a faint clicking noise 2 shifts earlier. The corridor was busy with off-duty residents, mostly Valith, moving between the communal areas and their quarters. Machen walked through them the way water moves through a channel. He went where the space was, and the crowd parted without acknowledging him. No one looked at him. No one stepped aside for him. They simply did not see him, the way you do not see a handrail or a ceiling tile or any other part of the infrastructure that exists only to serve. But one person did see him. A Valith child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, small for her age, with the pale blue-gray skin of the residential caste. She was sitting on the corridor floor outside a quarters door, holding a small mechanical toy, a walking figure with articulated legs that was not walking. She held it up and made the legs move with her fingers, but the toy's internal spring was clearly broken, and the legs flopped uselessly. Machen stopped. He did not need to stop. The junction box was 40 meters further down the corridor. The child was not his responsibility. The toy was not a station system. It was not in any work order. But he knelt down beside her, held out his hand, and said, "Can I look at that?" The child stared at him with the open, unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to look through maintenance workers. She placed the toy in his palm. Machen turned it over, pressed a thumbnail into the seam of the casing, and popped it open. Inside, a tiny coil spring had slipped its anchor pin, a common failure in cheap mechanisms, the kind of thing that happened when the tolerances were cut too thin at the factory. He pulled a fine-gauge wire from his kit, bent it into a hook, reseated the spring on its pin, and clicked the casing shut. The whole operation took perhaps 90 seconds. He set the toy on the floor and pressed the activation stud. The little figure walked 3 steps, turned, and walked 3 steps back, its articulated legs moving with the precise, faintly absurd dignity of a mechanical thing performing its one purpose. The child laughed. She picked up the toy and hugged it against her chest and looked at Machen with an expression that Telvari recognized from her studies of cross-species social dynamics, but had never actually seen directed at a human: pure, uncomplicated gratitude. Machen stood up, nodded to the child, and continued toward the junction box. He did not look back. He did not wait for thanks from the child's parents, who were presumably on the other side of the quarters door and had not witnessed any of it. He simply fixed the thing because it was broken, the same way he fixed everything else. Telvari followed him. She did not write this one down. She did not need to. It was the kind of lesson that wrote itself into whatever part of the brain stored the things that mattered. After the valve incident on the 4th day, Telvari followed Machen through the rest of his shift in silence. She watched him replace a corroded junction box on deck 16, a 20-minute job that he performed with the unhurried precision of someone who had done it 100 times and intended to do it correctly this 101st time. She watched him recalibrate a humidity sensor in the hydroponics bay by holding a damp cloth near the intake and adjusting the sensitivity by ear, listening to the fan pitch change until it matched whatever internal reference he carried. She watched him stop in a corridor on deck 18 to tighten a wall panel that was rattling, a panel that no work order had been filed for, a panel that he simply noticed was loose as he walked past. "Why do you fix things that aren't assigned to you?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Because they're broken." "But the work order system exists to prioritize." "The work order system exists to make sure someone can say the work was prioritized. It doesn't exist to make sure the work gets done." He tightened the last fastener and slid his multi-spanner back into his belt. "Those are different things." She wrote that down in her datapad. She was not sure why, except that it felt like something she should remember. On the 4th day, the directorate inspector arrived. Telvari heard about it before she saw it. The maintenance communication channel lit up with terse warnings from the upper decks. A full compliance review. Station Director Vailanash herself had authorized it, in response to a series of environmental irregularities that had been logged over the previous quarter. The inspector was a Vailith named Sorenthi, a senior engineering auditor from the Directorate's Central Compliance Division, and he had brought a team of 6 junior auditors and a reputation for career-ending findings. Machen heard the news while he was elbow-deep in a ventilation manifold on deck 15, clearing a blockage that had been reducing airflow to the crew quarters below. He pulled his arm out, wiped it on his coveralls, and said, "That's going to be a problem." "Why?" Telvari asked. "Because half the fixes I've made on this station aren't in the system." He pulled a rag from his pocket and cleaned his multi-spanner. "I fixed them because they needed fixing. I didn't always file the paperwork because the paperwork takes longer than the fix, and there's always something else that needs fixing." Telvari felt the floor shift slightly beneath her understanding. How many undocumented modifications are there? Machen looked at her. The expression on his face was not embarrassment or defiance. It was the expression of a man who had done arithmetic in his head and did not love the number he had arrived at. In my sector, probably 300. 300 unauthorized modifications to a Valith Directorate station. Telvari's training told her this was a catastrophic compliance failure. Her 3 days of following Machen through the crawlspaces told her something different. It was the reason the station still worked. The inspection began on the upper decks and moved downward. Telvari heard the reports through the maintenance channel systems passing review on the upper levels, where the engineering teams were larger, better funded, and working within sanctioned parameters. The inspectors moved with bureaucratic thoroughness, checking every logged modification against the original engineering specifications, flagging deviations, issuing preliminary citations. Machen continued to work while they waited. He did not stop. He did not prepare a defense or organize his documentation or contact the station's labor relations office. He went to Deck 16 and replaced a corroded coupling in a condensation drain line that had been weeping for 2 days. He went to Deck 20 and recalibrated a pressure sensor that was reading 3% high. He went to the hydroponics bay and checked the humidity filters he had recalibrated on the second day, confirming they were holding. "Shouldn't you be getting ready for the inspection?" Telvari asked, following him through the Deck 20 service corridor. He did not look up from the pressure sensor. This is getting ready. If the systems are running right when they check them, the data speaks for itself. And if they don't check the systems, if they only check the paperwork? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then the paperwork is going to be a problem, but the systems will still be running right, and that matters more." She did not argue. She was beginning to understand that for Machen, the work was not a means to an outcome. The work was the outcome. The systems running right was its own justification, independent of whether anyone noticed or approved or documented it. He existed in a framework of purpose that had nothing to do with the Directorate's compliance structure, and everything to do with the 40,000 people breathing and drinking and staying warm above him. By the time they reached the environmental sector on Deck 14, Machen had been on shift for 9 hours. He had not slept. He had not eaten since the broth he had shared with Telvari at the start of the shift, the same broth, from the same thermos, poured into the same dented cup. He was sitting on an overturned supply crate outside the primary air handling unit, his multi-spanner across his knees, when Inspector Sorrenthi walked in with his team. Sorrenthi was tall, even for a Valith 2.5 meters. The formal robes of the Directorate's Compliance Division draped precisely over his narrow frame, his skin the pale silver blue that marked the administrative caste. His eyes swept the corridor, catalogued Machen's stained coveralls and the tools laid out on the supply crate, and dismissed them in a single glance. "This is the environmental subsector for Decks 14 through 22, Sorrenthi asked. "Yes," Machen said. "And you are the maintenance lead." "I am." Sorrenthi consulted his datapad. "I'm showing significant deviation from specification on 17 systems in this sector. Thermal regulation, water reclamation, atmospheric processing, gravity vibration dampening, none of these modifications appear in the engineering change log." "That's because I didn't log them." Sorrenthi looked at Machen the way a magistrate looks at a confession that arrived before the trial. "You made unauthorized modifications to Directorate infrastructure." "I made fixes." "Fixes require authorization. Authorization requires documentation. Documentation requires review by a licensed Valith engineer of oversight grade or higher." Sorrenthi's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never crawled inside a conduit housing. "Are you a licensed Valith engineer?" "I'm a human," Machen said. "We don't qualify for your licensing system." The silence in the corridor had weight. Telvari felt it settle on her shoulders. She looked at the junior auditors behind Sorrenthi, young Valith in clean robes, datapads at the ready, their expressions caught between professional neutrality and something harder. Contempt, she realized. The quiet, administrative kind. Sorrenthy began the review. He walked through the sector with his auditors, checking every system, every junction box, every valve, every filter, every modification Machen had made over 11 years. Telvari followed, 3 steps behind Machen, watching. The inspector found the cut welds on the manual override valves. He flagged them. He found the recalibrated humidity sensors in the hydroponics bay. He flagged them. He found the replacement junction box on deck 16, the one Machen had installed using a component rated for higher thermal tolerance than the original specification called for, because the original specification was wrong and the standard-rated components burned out every 8 months. Sorrenthy flagged it. He found the modified air handling filters, the ones Machen had replaced on a 72-hour cycle, instead of the prescribed 120, because he had noticed the biofilm degradation. Sorrenthy flagged the schedule deviation. Each flag was a citation. Each citation was a formal finding against the maintenance lead responsible. Telvari watched the count rise on Sorrenthy's datapad 17, 23, 31, 44, and felt something building in her chest that she could not name. It was not anger, exactly. It was the feeling of watching someone be punished for keeping people alive. Machen walked beside Sorrenthy through every inspection point. He did not argue. He did not explain. He answered direct questions with direct answers. Yes, he had made that modification. No, he had not filed the paperwork. Yes, he understood that was a violation, and otherwise he was silent. At the 47th citation, Sorrenthy stopped in front of the primary water reclamation array on deck 17. The array was one of Machen's most significant modifications. He had rerouted the intake manifold to bypass a design flaw in the original filtration housing that caused pressure spikes during high-demand cycles. The reroute was clean, professional, and completely undocumented. "This is a Class 3 structural modification," Sorrenthy said, his voice flat. "Unauthorized Class 3 modifications to life support infrastructure carry mandatory suspension of maintenance privileges pending a full engineering review." He looked at Machen. "You understand what that means?" "It means you're going to shut me down," Machen said. "It means this sector will be serviced by licensed Valith engineers until the review is complete. Your tools will be impounded. Your access credentials will be suspended." Sorrenthy paused. "I'll also be recommending termination of your labor contract." Telvari watched Machen's face. She had been watching it for 4 days now, watching it while he worked, while he explained, while he solved problems that nobody else could see. She had learned to read the small movements, the tightening around the eyes that meant he was thinking, the slight downturn of the mouth that meant he had found something wrong, the brief softening that happened when he poured broth into her cup and handed it over. Now his face was still, not defeated, not angry, just still, the expression of a man who had known this was possible for 11 years and had done the work anyway. "All right," he said. He unclipped his multi-spanner from his belt. He set it on the supply crate beside the water reclamation array, next to the rag and the small tin of lubricant he carried everywhere. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his access card, the simple gray rectangle that let him move through the station's lower decks, through the crawl spaces and service corridors and mechanical rooms that no one with rank ever entered, and set it on top of the multi-spanner. Then he turned and walked toward the lift. Telvari stood in the corridor and watched him go. The auditors were already moving, scanning the water reclamation array, entering data. Sorrenthy was speaking into his communicator, requesting a replacement engineering team. The machinery hummed around them, the machinery that Machen had kept humming for 11 years, doing the work the station's own engineering protocols could not account for. She did not follow him, not immediately. She stood there, holding her datapad, and felt the shape of something she had not been taught at the academy pressing against the inside of her ribs. One of the junior auditors, a young Valith woman about Telvari's own age, with the pale silver skin of the administrative caste, and a datapad held at the precise angle prescribed by audit protocol, glanced at Telvari as she passed. "Unfortunate placement," the auditor said. Her voice carried the particular softness of someone offering condolence for a social embarrassment. "Being assigned to a human, at least it's over now." Telvari looked at her, at the clean robes, at the unblemished hands, at the datapad that had never been held against a pipe to feel a vibration, never been propped on a filter housing to record a biofilm count, never been pressed into service as anything other than a clipboard for someone else's decisions. "It isn't over," Telvari said, "and it wasn't unfortunate." The auditor's expression flickered a brief, uncertain movement, the kind that happened when a social script encountered a line it did not contain. She moved on without responding. Telvari watched her go and felt the thing in her ribs sharpen into something that had a name after all. It was loyalty. That evening, the licensed Valith engineering team arrived to take over the environmental sector. Telvari was reassigned to them, her apprenticeship transferred automatically, a bureaucratic formality that required no one's consent. The team was 6 engineers, all commissioned, all carrying the latest diagnostic equipment and the full authority of the directorate. They began by restoring the valve assemblies to their original automated-only configuration. They re-welded the manual overrides shut. Within 3 hours, the portside residential ring began experiencing thermal fluctuations. Nothing dangerous, not yet, but the temperature in the crew quarters on deck 15 dropped 4 degrees, and the temperature in the corridor outside the hydroponics bay rose 7. Complaints began arriving from the residents. The engineering team ran diagnostics. The diagnostics showed the automated system was functioning within specification. The problem was that the specification was wrong. Telvari knew this. She had watched Machen explain it, not in a lecture but in the doing, lying on his back in the crawlspace, one hand on the manual override, the other feeling the pipe temperature through his gloves, adjusting until the system balanced in a way the automation could not achieve, because the automation did not know the pipes had settled unevenly over the station's 40-year lifespan. She said nothing. She was an apprentice. Apprentices did not correct licensed engineers. By the end of the first day, Telvari had counted 14 separate temperature complaints from the residential ring. The engineering team ran the diagnostics again. The diagnostics returned clean. The portside ring continued to fluctuate. She found herself standing in the corridor outside the first valve assembly, looking at the freshly welded manual override. The weld was neat and precise, better than Machen's original cuts had been, actually, in terms of metallurgical finish. The licensed engineers had sealed it beautifully. They had sealed it perfectly. They had sealed the only thing that kept the system working. She wanted to say something. She held her datapad and looked at the senior engineer, a Valith named Leshurin, commissioned, with the broad silver sash of the engineering division, and the words formed in her throat and stopped there. She was an apprentice. Leshurin had 12 years of commissioned service. The hierarchy was clear, and the hierarchy did not include a first-week trainee correcting a veteran. But the pipes did not care about hierarchy. The pipes cared about physics, and the physics said the automated actuators were going to seize again before the shift was over. She held her silence and hated it. On the second day without Machen, the water reclamation filters on deck 19 began showing elevated biofilm counts. The engineering team replaced the filters on the standard 120-hour schedule. The counts continued to rise. They replaced the filters again. The counts rose again. They ran a full diagnostic on the biofilm culture medium and found nothing wrong. The problem was the vibration frequency from the gravity generators, the same problem Machen had identified years ago, the one he had solved by simply checking the filters more often. No software patch, no engineering review, just a man on his hands and knees in a filter housing every 72 hours, because he had noticed what the people who designed the system had not. On the second night, Telvari could not sleep. She lay in her apprentice berth on deck 12, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the station's systems through the wall. She could hear the air-handling unit cycling, a sound she had never paid attention to before, a background noise as unremarkable as her own heartbeat. But now she listened to it differently. She listened for the hesitation Machen had taught her to notice, a brief stutter in the fan cycle that indicated a bearing wearing unevenly. The kind of thing that would not show up on a diagnostic for another 3 months, but that a hand pressed against the housing could feel right now. She pressed her palm against the wall. The metal was cold and smooth. She could not feel the bearing. She was not Machen. But she would learn. On the third day, the rerouted water intake manifold, the Class 3 modification that had triggered Machen's suspension, was restored to its original configuration. Within 6 hours, the pressure spikes returned. A junction seal blew on deck 17, flooding a storage bay with reclaimed water. No one was injured, but the bay held 3 months of preserved rations for the lower deck workers, and all of it was ruined. Telvari watched the engineering team work through the night, trying to find the root cause of the pressure spikes. They ran simulations. They consulted the original engineering plans. They brought in a specialist from the station's central engineering division. None of them crawled into the filtration housing to look at the pipe junction that Machen had rerouted, the junction where the original design created a 90-degree elbow turn in a high-pressure line, a design choice that any plumber on Earth would have called amateur. She knew because Machen had shown her. On her second day, he had taken her to that junction and put her hand on the pipe while the system cycled, and she had felt the hammer pulse of water slamming into the elbow turn, and he had said, "Feel that? That's going to blow the seal every 8 months." The original engineers didn't account for the water density at this station's gravity setting. Different gravity, different fluid dynamics. The plans were drawn for a station at 0.85 standard. We run at 0.92. He had shrugged. I just put in a gentle curve instead of a hard corner. Hasn't blown since. She had written that down too. On the fourth day without Machen, Telvari requested a meeting with Inspector Sorrenthi. She was kept waiting for 2 hours outside his temporary office on the administrative deck, a clean, well-lit space on the upper levels, far from the crawlspaces and conduit housings where the actual work happened. When she was finally admitted, Sorrenthi looked at her the way he had looked at the environmental corridor, with the polite disinterest of someone who had already reached his conclusions. "You're the apprentice," he said, "the one assigned to the human." "I was assigned to maintenance lead Machen, yes." "Your reassignment to the Valith engineering team is already processed. Is there a problem with the new placement?" "The problem isn't with my placement. The problem is with the engineering." Sorrenthi set down his datapad. Telvari opened hers. She had spent the previous night compiling everything, every modification Machen had made that she had witnessed, every explanation he had given, every physical principle he had demonstrated by putting her hand on a pipe or her ear to a fan housing or her eye to a filter mesh. She had organized it by system, by priority, by the engineering failure each modification corrected. The thermal regulation valves on the port side ring require manual intervention because the automated actuators seize under sustained load. The manufacturer's thermal tolerance rating is based on bench testing, not operational cycling at this station's ambient temperature. Maintenance lead Machen identified this 11 years ago and corrected it by restoring the manual overrides. She scrolled. The water reclamation filters degrade at twice the prescribed rate, due to vibration interference from the gravity generators operating at 0.92 standard, instead of the design specification of 0.85. He corrected this by increasing inspection frequency. She scrolled again. The intake manifold on deck 17 contains a 90-degree elbow turn in a high-pressure line that creates water hammer at this station's gravity-adjusted fluid density. He corrected this with a curved reroute that eliminated the pressure spike entirely. She looked up. Sorrenthy was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "There are 47 citations on your list," she said. "I can explain 31 of them. Every one is a correction of a design error or a manufacturing deficiency that was not caught during the station's original commissioning. The modifications were not documented because the documentation system requires authorization from a licensed Valith engineer, and no licensed Valith engineer was willing to authorize modifications proposed by a human maintenance worker." She closed her datapad. "He wasn't breaking your rules because he didn't care about them," she said. "He was breaking them because people would have been hurt if he followed them." Sorrenthy said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're 11th rank from the academy." "Yes." "11th out of 1,400. One position from a commission posting." "Yes." "And you spent your apprenticeship in a crawlspace with a human pipe fitter." "I spent my apprenticeship learning how this station actually works. That is not the same thing I would have learned on a warship." Sorrenthy picked up his datapad. He scrolled through Telvari's data slowly, the way someone reads evidence they did not expect to receive. The silence stretched. She let it stretch. Machen had taught her that too, not in words but in the way he worked. He never rushed to fill silence. He let the work speak, and if the work was good, the silence became a kind of answer. "I'll need to verify these claims independently," Sorrenthy said finally. "Then verify them. Start with the portside thermal regulation." The engineering team re-welded the manual overrides shut 3 days ago. The residential ring has been experiencing temperature fluctuations ever since. Check the complaint logs. Sorrenthy checked the complaint logs. Then he checked the water reclamation biofilm counts. Then he sent a junior auditor to physically inspect the Deck 17 pipe junction, and the auditor came back wet to the knees and white-faced, because the junction seal had blown again during the inspection, and the auditor had been standing in the storage bay when it happened. Sorrenthy said nothing for a while. He opened the complaint logs. Telvari watched his eyes move across the data, the temperature fluctuation reports, the biofilm count spikes, the junction seal failure on Deck 17. 14 residential complaints on day 1, 23 on day 2. A storage bay flooded on day 3. The data did not argue. The data simply was. "How did you compile this?" he asked quietly. "I followed him," she said. "For 4 days. I wrote down what he showed me. I asked him why he did what he did, and he answered. He answered a Valith apprentice's questions about his unauthorized modifications. He answered his apprentice's questions about how to keep the station running. There is a difference." Sorrenthy looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, "Show me." They went to the lower decks together. Telvari led the inspector through the same corridors Machen had walked her through: the valve assemblies, the filter bays, the junction boxes, the pipe housings. She showed him the things Machen had shown her: the weld cuts, the gasket compressions, the rerouted manifold. At each one, she explained the engineering failure it corrected, and at each one, Sorrenthy checked the original specifications against the physical reality. The specifications were wrong, again and again and again. The verification took 2 days. Sorrenthy worked through it with the methodical precision of a man who built his career on being right, and was now confronting the possibility that he had been wrong in a way that mattered. Telvari watched him move through the lower decks the first time, she suspected, he had ever been below Deck 10, checking each of Machen's modifications against the physical reality of the systems they served. She watched his expression change as the data accumulated. Not all at once. Engineers did not change their minds in dramatic moments of revelation. They changed them in increments, one verified data point at a time, the way a tide turns. You could not see any single wave reverse, but eventually you looked up and the water was moving the other direction. On the 6th day without Machen, Sorrenthy summoned him back to the station. Machen arrived on the morning transport, wearing clean coveralls the same style, the same patches at the elbows but laundered. He carried his personal tool kit in one hand and his thermos in the other. Telvari met him at the docking bay. She had not been asked to. She had simply known, in the way she was learning to know things, that being there was the right thing to do. "They want me back?" Machen asked. He did not sound surprised. He did not sound relieved. He sounded like a man being told the weather. "Inspector Sorrenthy has revised his findings." Machen nodded. He looked at her tool kit, the apprentice kit she had been issued on her first day, still clean, barely used. Then he looked at her hands, and she saw him notice the oil stain on her right palm, the one she had gotten when she crawled into the Deck 17 filter housing to take photographs for her report. The stain would not wash out. She had tried. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Machen did not smile the way Valith smiled, broad and performative. It was smaller than that, a softening around the eyes, a brief downward glance that might have been the human equivalent of a nod of recognition. "You got dirty," he said. "I got educated," she said. He made a sound that she had learned over 4 days, was a human laugh compressed into a single exhale through the nose. Then he walked toward the lift, and she followed. The meeting with Sorrenthy was held in the station director's conference chamber, a vast room on Deck 3, crystal-paneled and climate-controlled to a precision that the lower decks would never see. Station Director Vailanash was present, seated at the head of a long table of polished composite, her pale lavender skin luminous under the chamber's carefully calibrated lighting. Her silver hair was drawn back in the formal arrangement of the administrative caste, and small crystalline filaments woven through it caught the light when she moved her head. Sorrenthy stood at the presentation display. Behind him, the full list of citations was projected on the crystal panel, 47 items, each one flagged and annotated. Machen sat at the far end of the table, his tool kit on the floor beside his chair, his thermos on the table in front of him. He looked out of place in the way that a wrench looks out of place on a dining table, not wrong, exactly, but belonging to a different category of purpose entirely. Telvari sat beside him. She had not been invited. No one had told her to leave. "I'll be brief," Sorrenthy said. He did not look at Machen. He looked at the station director. "My original findings identified 47 unauthorized modifications to life support infrastructure in the environmental sector, decks 14 through 22, made by maintenance lead Machen over an 11-year period. All 47 were correctly identified as deviations from the original engineering specification." He paused. 29 of those deviations have been independently verified as corrections to design errors or manufacturing deficiencies in the original station commissioning. In each case, the original specification was flawed, and the modification made by the maintenance lead was the correct engineering solution. 14 additional modifications are efficiency improvements that, while not correcting outright errors, demonstrably improved system performance beyond specification parameters. 4 modifications remain under review. Vailanash's expression did not change. She had the administrative caste's talent for stillness, a face that gave nothing away, eyes that processed information the way a system processes data, without visible reaction. But Telvari noticed her gaze move from Sorrenthy's display to Machen's hands, resting on the table beside the thermos. The scarred, oil-dark hands, the swollen knuckles. "You're telling me," the station director said, "that a human maintenance worker identified and corrected 29 engineering errors that our licensed engineers missed during 40 years of operation?" "Yes," Sorrenthy said. "And that when we removed his modifications and restored the original specifications, the systems began to fail?" "Yes." "And that 3 months of preserved rations for the lower deck workers were destroyed as a direct result of reversing one of his modifications?" Sorrenthy's silence was its own answer. Vailanash looked at Machen. She studied him the way Telvari had seen her study engineering proposals, with the careful attention of someone who understands that the most important data is often the data that does not fit the model. "Maintenance lead Machen," she said, "why didn't you file the documentation for your modifications?" Machen met her gaze. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He had the steadiness of a man who had been looking at problems longer than most people had been looking at anything. "Because the documentation system requires sign-off from a licensed Vailith engineer," he said. "And in 11 years, I never found one who would sign off on a modification proposed by a human." The conference chamber was very quiet. The climate control hummed at its precisely calibrated frequency. Somewhere below, in the crawlspaces and conduit housings and filter bays that kept 40,000 people alive, the systems Machen had built were waiting for someone to tend them. "I understand," Vailanash said. She looked at Sorrenthy. "Withdraw the citations, all 47. Director, withdraw them, and amend the documentation system to allow maintenance leads to file modification reports directly, without requiring countersignature from a licensed engineer, retroactive to cover existing undocumented work." She paused. "Additionally, I want a full audit of every sector on this station, not just the environmental section. If one maintenance worker found 29 design errors in his sector, I want to know how many are in the others." Sorrenthy began entering the amendments into his datapad. His auditors shifted in their seats. The crystal panels of the conference chamber caught the light and scattered it into soft prismatic patterns across the polished table. Vailanash looked at Machen again. "Is there anything else you need?" Machen glanced down at his thermos. Then he looked at Telvari, sitting beside him, her datapad on the table, the oil stain still visible on her right palm. "I need my apprentice back," he said. Vailanash's gaze moved to Telvari. The station director studied the young Vailith woman for a long moment. The apprentice satchel, the datapad full of engineering data compiled in a crawlspace, the oil stain that would not wash out. Then something shifted in the director's expression. Not a dramatic change, just a softening, the way a structural material softens when it reaches the temperature where it stops being rigid and starts being workable. "She's yours," Vailanash said. The meeting ended. Sorrenthy packed his datapads. The auditors filed out. The station director remained at her seat for a moment longer, watching Machen gather his tool kit and his thermos. And Telvari thought she saw Vailanash's eyes follow the human's hands the way they wrapped around the battered multi-spanner with the unconscious familiarity of a limb, the way they moved with purpose and without performance. Then Vailanash stood and left, and the conference chamber was empty except for the lingering scent of the station director's formal fragrance and the faint hum of the climate system holding the room at its precisely calibrated temperature. Telvari remained seated for a moment. She looked at the crystal panel where Sorrenthy's citations had been displayed, all 47, now withdrawn, now dissolved into the data architecture as though they had never existed. But they had existed, and the work they had tried to erase had existed for 11 years before that, and would exist for years to come, in every valve and filter and gasket and rerouted pipe that kept the station's people alive. She thought about something Machen had said on the second day, while they were inspecting a heat exchanger on Deck 19. She had asked him whether it bothered him that no one acknowledged his work, and he had been quiet for a while, and then he had said, "The pipes know." She had not understood it then. She understood it now. The pipes knew. The filters knew. The valves knew. And now, finally, someone else did too. Machen and Telvari rode the lift down in silence. Deck 3 to Deck 14, 11 floors, each one a step deeper into the station's working infrastructure, the lighting shifting from the crystal-calibrated glow of the administrative levels to the steady industrial illumination of the maintenance decks. The walls changed from polished composite to bare plating. The air changed from filtered and scented to the honest smell of lubricant and recycled atmosphere and warm metal. At Deck 14, the lift doors opened onto the environmental corridor. Machen's workstation was as he had left it, the supply crate, the tools laid out, the rag folded neatly beside the small tin of lubricant. Someone had left his access card on top of the multi-spanner. It sat there like a claim that had never been properly made. Machen picked up the card and clipped it to his coveralls. He picked up the multi-spanner and slid it into his belt. He picked up the rag and the lubricant tin and put them in his pockets. Then he opened his thermos, poured broth into the dented cup, and held it out to Telvari. She took it. The broth was cold. He had filled the thermos that morning before the transport, and it had been hours. She drank it anyway. It tasted the way it always tasted, thick, savory, unfamiliar, and exactly right. "The valve assemblies first," Machen said. "They welded the overrides shut again. We'll need to cut them." "I know," Telvari said. "I watched them do it." "Did you watch how I cut them the first time?" "Yes." "Then you cut them this time." He handed her a plasma cutter from his kit, a small one, sized for detail work, its grip worn smooth by years of use. "Same angle, same depth. Don't rush it." Telvari took the cutter. It was heavier than she expected. The grip was warm from his hands. She knelt beside the first valve assembly, positioned the cutter against the weld seam, and began. Machen stood behind her, not watching over her shoulder. He had already turned toward the water reclamation array, pulling the filter access panel open with the practiced ease of a man returning to a conversation he had stepped away from mid-sentence. But she heard him pause, heard him listen to the sound the cutter made as it bit into the weld. "Little shallower," he said without turning around. She adjusted. The cut smoothed out. The weld parted cleanly, and the manual override handle swung free. "Good," Machen said, just the one word. Then he was gone into the filter housing, and the sound of his work filled the corridor the way breath fills a chest, steady, rhythmic, and necessary. Telvari moved to the second valve, and the third. The welds on the third one were thicker. The engineering team had used a heavier bead, perhaps anticipating that someone might try to cut them again. She adjusted the cutter's intensity, found the sweet spot where the plasma bit without gouging, and worked through it in slow, even passes. The metal glowed cherry red along the seam, then parted, and the override handle dropped into her palm with a satisfying weight. On the fourth valve, she hit a snag. The weld had been applied over a structural bracket, and cutting through it risked weakening the bracket itself. She stopped, considered, remembered Machen showing her, on the second day, how to angle a cut along the grain of a weld bead to separate the filler material from the base metal without compromising the underlying structure. She repositioned the cutter, angled it 15 degrees off perpendicular, and cut along the grain. The weld peeled away cleanly. The bracket was undamaged. From inside the filter housing, Machen's voice, that one sounded different. It was a compound weld over a structural member. "I angled the cut along the grain." A pause, then, "Who taught you that?" "You did." Another pause, longer this time. She thought she heard the compressed exhale again, that one-note human laugh, but it might have been the ventilation system cycling. By the fifth valve, she was not thinking about the angle or the depth anymore. She was feeling it, the way the metal responded, the way the cutter spoke through her hands, the way the work had its own logic that no syllabus had ever taught her. She thought about the academy, about the exam that had ranked her 11th, one position from a commissioned life on a warship, one position from officers' quarters and clean hands, and the certainty that the systems worked because the specifications said they should. She had spent 4 years at the academy, 4 years of lectures and simulations and theoretical frameworks. She could calculate thermal transfer coefficients to 6 decimal places. She could design a ventilation system on paper that would pass every specification review the directorate had ever conceived. She could cite, from memory, the 17 safety protocols governing modifications to life support infrastructure on orbital platforms. And none of it, not 1 hour of it, had taught her what a failing gasket felt like under her thumb. None of it had taught her that the gap between the specification and the pipe was where the real engineering lived. None of it had taught her that the most important systems on a station of 40,000 souls were maintained by a man the system itself refused to see. She thought about the 9 hours Machen had worked before the inspector arrived, and the 11 years he had worked before the 9 hours, and the fact that he had done it knowing that no one would document it, no one would authorize it, and no one would thank him for it. He had done it because it needed doing. She finished the last valve on the corridor's port run and stood, her knees aching, her hands blackened with carbon residue from the cuts. The manual overrides were free. The thermal regulation system could breathe again. Within an hour, the temperature complaints from the residential ring stopped. No announcement was made. No report was filed. The 40,000 souls on the port side simply stopped being cold, and most of them would never know why, and that was exactly as it should be. The best maintenance was the kind nobody noticed. From inside the filter housing, she heard Machen's voice, muffled by pipe and plating. How many left on the starboard run? She checked her datapad. 12. We'll hit them after the filter swap. Bring the cutter. She clipped the plasma cutter to her belt, the way he clipped his multi-spanner. It hung there with a weight that felt like it belonged. That night, after the shift ended, Telvari sat in the lower deck canteen with Machen and the dock hands and the cargo loaders. She ate the same food they ate, station standard rations, nothing special, nothing elegant, served on metal trays under industrial lighting. Machen sat across from her, eating slowly, his thermos at his elbow, his hands wrapped around a cup of the black human drink he called coffee. Why did you stay? She asked. 11 years, no rank, no recognition. They eat better on deck 3 than you eat down here. You could have left. Machen looked at his coffee. He was quiet for a long time, not the silence of someone composing an answer, but the silence of someone deciding whether the answer was any of her business. Then he said, because the station needed someone who'd notice. Other people could notice. Other people could, they didn't. He took a sip of his coffee. Noticing isn't a skill you learn in school. It's a habit you build by caring about something long enough to see it properly. Most people stop looking at the pipes after the first year. After the second year, they stop hearing the fans. After the 5th year, they stop checking the filters because the schedule says they don't need to be checked yet. He set the cup down. I never stopped checking, that's all. He said it like it was simple. Telvari was beginning to understand that simple things were the hardest to do for a long time. She thought about what Sorrenthy had seen during those 2 days of verification, the inspector moving through the lower decks with increasing silence, his datapad filling with data that contradicted every assumption he had brought aboard. She thought about the moment in the conference chamber when Vailanash had looked at Machen's hands. The station director had understood something in that moment. Not just that Machen's modifications were correct, Sorrenthy's data had already established that. She had understood something about the nature of the hands themselves, about what it meant to have hands that looked like that, scarred and swollen and stained with the work of 11 years, and to keep reaching into the conduit housing anyway. to keep cutting the welds and checking the filters and reseating the gaskets, day after day, shift after shift, knowing that the system you served did not have a category for what you were. Machen was not a licensed engineer. He was not an officer. He was not even, in the strict bureaucratic sense, a technician. The Valeth classification system did not have a grade for human labor contractors that acknowledged technical expertise. He was simply a man who worked with his hands, and the station had no word for what that meant. Until today, until Valanash had looked at those hands and said, "I understand." 2 words, but Telvari had seen Machen's face when the station director said them. Not the face he wore when he fixed things, the calm, professional mask of a man engaged in work. Something else, something older and quieter and more fragile than professional competence. The face of a man who had been working in the dark for 11 years and had just been told that someone could see him. He had not said anything. He had simply picked up his tool kit and his thermos and walked to the lift. But Telvari had noticed, because she was learning to notice, that his hands were not quite steady when he clipped the access card back to his coveralls. Telvari looked at her own hands. The oil stain on her right palm had darkened with the day's work. Carbon residue had joined it. Her nails were chipped. Her knuckles were sore. She thought about what the station director had said, "She's yours," and what it meant. Not ownership, not assignment. Something quieter than both, and more costly. The acknowledgement that the most important thing Telvari could learn was not in any classroom on the upper decks, but in a crawlspace on deck 15, from a man who fixed things because they were broken, who noticed things because he cared, who had kept 40,000 people alive for 11 years by doing the work that no one else could see. "Machen," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for the broth." He looked at her, that small softening around the eyes again. The human expression that she was beginning to understand was not a smile but something older and more honest than a smile. An acknowledgement, a recognition. "Tomorrow we start on the gravity dampener calibration," he said. "It's a 2-person job. I'll show you how to read the frequency by feel." By feel. You put your hand on the housing and you listen with your fingers. He stood, picked up his tray and carried it to the return rack. It's not in any manual, but once you know what right feels like, you never forget. Telvari watched him walk out of the canteen, a human in faded gray coveralls, carrying an empty thermos, returning to the quarters on the lower deck where the lights were dimmer, and the walls were bare plating, and the only recognition he had ever received was the station continuing to breathe. She looked down at her datapad. The screen showed the day's work log: 12 valve overrides cut, 4 filters replaced, 1 junction box recalibrated. Unremarkable work, essential work. The kind of work that kept a station of 40,000 alive, and that no one with rank would ever think about. She closed the datapad and went to find a clean thermos. Tomorrow, she decided, she would bring the broth.